Hello, just in case you haven't met me yet, I'm Jen Buchanan of Blue Beach House Art. Way back in 2017, I created my very first video tutorial, and it was also a blurry background. However, that one wasn't as good as it could have been, obviously because it was my first time. Since then, I've learned an awful lot about teaching painting online and getting my students the best results, and about creating videos. So today I am presenting my new version of the blurry background video, and it includes the in focus bird on top, the rainbow lorikeet, that is really going to make your painting pop. I really hope you like it. If you do, please let me know, and subscribe to my channel if you're not already subscribed. And well, I guess you don't want to hear me talk all day, so let's get on with the painting. I'm going to be working on a 12-inch by 16-inch or 30cm by 40cm canvas, and I'm using 4 free flow colours for the background: Cobalt Blue, Cadmium Yellow Light, Ultramarine Blue, and a tiny bit of Quinacridone Magenta. I think that's how you say that, Quinacridone. Alright, that's how I'm saying it anyway. The magenta is not strictly necessary. I'm just using it to get some nice darks in there when that colour mixes with the green. When paint pouring, I like to have the paint really fluid so it flows nicely around the canvas. Therefore, I mix my free flow paint with water and painting medium in 3 equal parts. I've used some old bottles of paint to store the mix because then I can squeeze it out onto the canvas, and I test the thickness of the paint by turning the bottle upside down. If the paint drips out and forms a nice round blob, then it's just right. A little spray of water on the canvas before I start will also help to get things flowing. Okay, here comes the fun part. Messy but fun. First, I'll squeeze out some of the cobalt blue into a random pattern all over the canvas. Then comes the yellow. I've tried to add more yellow at the top because I want the overall effect to be like light in the forest. Then I add some ultramarine blue to create a darker green near the forest floor, or the bottom of the canvas. Actually, I'm just going to add a few splashes of phthalo blue in there too, because that colour is really transparent, which will help to make my darks a bit darker. A few tiny spots of the magenta can go here at the bottom also. Okay, now I pick up the canvas and tilt it at an angle until the paint begins to flow. Once it starts to run over the edge, I'll change the angle so that it flows in a different direction. I don't want the paint to run any one way for too long though, because that will give me stripes. So I gently roll the canvas around to keep the paint moving. When I can see that there's a fair bit of paint running over the sides, I just run my finger along the edge to spread it, and that will eliminate any white areas on the sides of the canvas. Time to put the canvas down and have a progress check. If there are any areas of white on the front, I can add a few little more spots of paint there, and you can see I have now put in a touch of the magenta also. I'm not entirely sure if that was a good idea. Not to worry though, if I don't like the look of the red, I can just tilt the canvas until most of it disappears or runs off the edge. The longer I keep turning, the blurrier the background will appear. If I go too far, I can just add back a few more splashes of paint and then start turning again until I'm happy with the overall look. That little bright spot closest to me is just some light coming in through the window, so I will quickly close the blind. And now my blurry background is done. I'm going to leave this to dry completely before going any further. I would say at least 24 hours. To start my bird, I'll first sketch the outline onto the canvas, then paint over that shape with some white. My reference photo for this painting was not one of my own, but one I found online with a Creative Commons license. That means it's free for anyone to use. I'll put a link to the photo in the notes below this video in case you want to use the same one. If you're not confident with drawing, you can print out the photo, cut the bird out and trace around it. So, onto the painting. The colours I'm going to use for the bird are Indian Yellow, Cadmium Red, Ultramarine Blue and Pthalo Turquoise. I deliberately chose different colours to those I used in the background to try and make the bird stand out as much as possible. By the way, if you accidentally go over the lines of your sketch with the white paint, you can just remove the excess paint with a clean, wet brush. Once I have the white paint in, I can again sketch in the rougher details over the top. The first thing I will do is to paint in a base colour over all the bird, and I'm going to make it nice and bright, just the way I like it. I'll start with the yellow on the breast, then move on to the tail. Then there's this little bit at the back of the bird's head, and a few little bits where the wings and legs meet the body. I'll be using a medium round brush for a lot of this painting, but a smaller brown brush might be useful for getting into the tight corners and painting the finer details. Next, I'll add some red to the centre of the breast and soften it outwards so I end up with a two-tone finish. Because the yellow paint is still wet, I can also create an orange in between to help transition from red to yellow. I do that by just softening the red colour outwards a bit. If your yellow paint is already dried, you can just mix the red and yellow together to create your orange. I'm also going to use the red paint to block in the base colour on the eye, the beak, and once again some stray little feathers where the wings and legs meet the body. Now the head and the lower part of the breast can be painted in ultramarine blue. This is a fairly transparent colour, so you could give this part 2 coats if you like. It's not necessary though, because we'll be adding more layers to this later, which will eliminate the visible brush strokes. Next, I'll cover the wings and legs with the Pthalo Turquoise. I've decided to add just a little bit of white to this to tone it down, because this colour, when pure, is very dark. The tree branch is surprisingly easy. I'm going to paint the 3 primary colours separately and then let the mixing happen on the canvas so that I end up with brown. I like to call this deconstructed colour. First I'll start with the ultramarine blue. I'm going to tone down the colour a bit by adding a small amount of red and yellow. The next row of paint will be just yellow, and finally the red goes at the top. A bit of white has been added to the red to tone it down a bit. I've used a small flat brush here to get a bit of texture in the branch, and you can see how the colours, when mixed together, have made the branch appear brown. Not a flat dull brown, but one that makes the branch look round because it shows some highlights and shadows. I'll also add a thin line of pale ultramarine blue and white at the top to show where the direct light is hitting the branch. Next, I paint in the area around the eye, the nostrils and the claws using a black that I have made by mixing the turquoise with the red. That's one of my favourite colour combos for making black. On second thoughts, I am going to quickly give the blue parts another coat of paint. I don't like the way the transparent nature of the ultramarine has left a dark area at the neck where the blue meets the red. Okay, the base colour is in, so now it's time to add some shadows. Every object I paint always has a base colour, a highlight and a shadow. That is the foundation of my tricolour method. Shadow colours are usually made by taking the base colour and adding a bit of its complementary. Complementary colours are those that are opposites on the colour wheel. If you don't have a colour wheel, you can download one for free from my website, bluebeachhouseart.com. For the shadows on the body and head of the bird, I'll start with the ultramarine blue and then tone it down by adding a little bit of red and a little bit of yellow. When deciding exactly where the shadows should go, I try to imagine the parts of the bird that are being hidden from the light. Before I can do that though, I need to identify the direction from which the light is coming. It's actually a little tricky in this painting because there's a lot of reflected and filtered light to deal with. To keep it simple though, I've determined that the light source is at the top left of the canvas. The wing on the left is casting a shadow onto the left side of the body, so I'll add some shadow colour there, and the body is casting a shadow onto the left side of the right leg, so I'll add some more shadow there. The shadow area on the head is mostly at the bottom because there is more light hitting the top. I'm softening out the edges of each shadow upwards and to the right. I'll also add a bit of shadow at the join between the breast and the body because I don't want that line to appear too straight. For the wings, I make the shadow colour by starting with the turquoise and adding its complementary red. Well, strictly speaking, green is the complementary of red, but in this case, the near complementary colour of turquoise works really well. I don't want this colour to be quite as black as previously, so I don't add quite as much red this time. I'm just applying shadows to the wings for now. There appears to be a few rows of feathers here, so I will paint a shadow beneath each row, extending it upwards here and there to show the gaps between the individual feathers. The legs don't have such deep shadows, so I'll leave that bit until later. I'm going to use this same shadow colour for a few tiny bits on the breast of the bird. I want a really strong contrast here to show some feathers that are sticking out. So the previous shadow colour mix I made with more turquoise than red will be just right. I apply a few horizontal lines and then soften out the bottom edges. While we're on the red, I will add a very thin line of shadow to the bottom and left-hand parts of the beak and then soften the colour outwards. Now I can add a little more turquoise to this paint mix and add the shadows on the legs. A little bit on both the left and right hand sides of each leg will show that they are rounded. Any area in a painting that you don't want to appear completely flat will need to have more than one tone in it, even in the shadows. Therefore, I'm going to add a lighter tone over the dark shadow areas on the body and head to show some of the individual feathers. I want the contrast between these two colours to be subtle because this is still a shadow area where there's no direct light. Therefore, I'm going to paint a mid-tone of ultramarine blue and white over the dark blue we have already applied. I take a small round brush and paint a few dabs over the top of the shadow colour to show the feathers. I do this on the head, the body and the legs, leaving only a small amount of the shadow colour showing. The top of the head is where most of the light is hitting this bird, so I really want to show a nice, high contrasting highlight colour. Again, I look to the complementary colour. For toning down, we mix complementary colours together, but to achieve maximum contrast, they should be laid side by side. So I'm going to use a very pale mix of orange, made with my red and yellow, and lots of white. This time I take a very fine brush and starting at the top of the head, I paint some very fine lines to represent the small feathers there. I try to paint these lines in the direction that the feathers would lay. And I keep going until I'm happy with the effect, always making sure that there are more of these lines at the top. By the time I'm finished, the top of this bird's head is almost completely pale orange. You can soften the small strokes a bit near the bottom of the head because the feathers there are a little larger. The brush strokes get a little larger on the body and legs, and there are not too many of them because not so much light is making it down there. Remember that acrylic paint goes darker as it dries, so if it looks a little too light to begin with, it will end up being just right. You can soften the colour a bit there too.
Before I go any further, I just want to make a small adjustment here. The feathers on the breast look too bitsy or spotty to me, so I'm going to blend some of them together with more of the mid-tone blue. There's no need to show every single feather. When you show just a few, the human brain is clever enough to reproduce them and then interpret it in the viewer's eyes as feathers all over. Now, when it comes to the shadows and highlights on the breast, there does not appear to be a lot of contrast because not too much direct light is hitting the bird there. Therefore, I'll use a slightly toned down version of the orange for the shadows, mostly on the right-hand side. That means adding a very small amount of blue to a red and yellow mix. For the feathers in the middle, a highlight colour can be made to go on top of the red base colour by adding yellow. If you try to add white to red for a highlight colour, it's just going to turn a dull pink. For the highlights on the left hand side, I'll simply add a bit of white to my yellow. Make sure you add your highlights directly above the shadows, especially those little dark lines that we applied earlier. This is going to show the edges of each of the feathers. Again, I'm trying to avoid showing every detail on the breast so it doesn't look too spotty. I'll introduce a few random bits of red here too to break up the line between red and yellow feathers a bit more. Next comes the highlight on the green wings and legs. Similar to the red on the breast, adding white to create a highlight colour is just going to dull down this turquoise. Therefore, you can again use the yellow for the lighter edges of the feathers on the wing. The wing on the right, I mean. You can't see any of the feathers on the left wing. We already painted in the shadows beneath each row of feathers, so that will give you a guide as to where you should start. I'll define the edge of each of these feathers by painting a thin line of highlight colour, the yellow, to the bottom and left of each one, and then I'll soften that colour outwards to the right and upwards. For the wing on the left hand side, I'll just add a very thin line of light at the edge. For the legs, just like with the shadows, I again want the contrast to be very subtle, so just a soft line down the middle will do. Now for the tail. This is probably going to be the most difficult part of this bird because this time you have to show filtered light rather than direct light. In fact, I've changed my mind already about the base colour and I've decided to paint a layer of orange over this yellow. I'll still leave the tiniest bit of yellow showing at the edges though. Once the orange has dried, I'll start to add the shadows. For this, the colour will be the orange toned down with some blue. I want it to look more brown than grey, a fairly dark brown, so I'll add a little bit more red here as well. There's a line of feathers running down each side of this tail, so I'll begin to define them by painting some curves in the shadow colour that will be on the left-hand edges of each feather. The end of the highest tail feather is about halfway down the tail, because we have to leave room for the little wedge tail at the top. Then I will gently soften the edge of this dark colour. I grappled quite a bit with the decision on the colour for the highlight here, but I settled on a pale mix of ultramarine blue and white. I want to show light, but it is filtered light, so it should be toned down. Once I paint this pale blue over the orange base colour, I get the effect I'm looking for of a pale brown colour. Then I'll add a small amount of only yellow directly beneath the bottom of each feather and soften that colour downwards. That way we'll be able to see where each feather ends. I apologise if my hand's in the way here. It was a bit fiddly. You'll just have to take my word for it as to where you should put the colour. Okay, it's not perfect, but I'm reasonably happy with it. Now I can go back and add the little wedge of short tail feathers. First I'll paint back in a triangle of yellow to create a base to work from. I'm going to add a bit of white to this yellow to make sure it's nice and opaque. Then I'll go over most of this yellow with some orange, leaving a little yellow still showing at the edges. Now, again, it is difficult for me to show you this part because I'm working in vertical brush strokes. What I'm doing is adding several dabs of the turquoise to each side of this triangle to represent the green feathers in the short tail. Then again, just as we did on the wings, I can add some yellow to the bottom and left-hand edges of each one so we get some variation in tones. Because this is filtered light, I don't want the contrast to be too strong, so I'm going to add the yellow before the green paint dries, using a wet-in-wet painting technique. I think I'll add a thin line of light around the edges of the short tail with this colour too. Now there's just a few finishing touches to go. We'll need to add a very small black dot in the middle of the red eye to show the pupil, and then after that dries, you can add a tiny highlight of very pale blue to the top left corner of the eye. You might want to switch to your finest brush for this. Get it loaded up with a lot of paint and then just dab gently with the very end of the brush. If you then dip the brush into the water until you're left with just a watery paint mix on the brush, you can use this to paint a very fine line around the rest of the eyeball, and this will show a glassy reflection in the eye. Then you can paint another line of this colour around the circumference of the eye to show the skin there. Then I'll load my brush up again and add a little bit of light to the top of the nostrils and the beak. Just a tiny little bit of shine here. Then, of course, I'll need to add a highlight on the top of the claws in the same colour, pale ultramarine blue and white. If you go too far with the highlight at any time, you can always add back some of the shadow colour later. Everything is fixable. I also want to touch up a few highlights in yellow. I'll first tease out the edges of these little random feathers at the top of the wings so that they blend in more with the surrounding feathers. I can do the same at the top of the legs and add a bit more light to the front of the legs to make them look more rounded. The same can be done for the red and green feathers where needed. I seem to have lost my shadow beneath this wing on the left here too, so I will add that back in. There should also be a tiny touch of green at the back of his head here. If the eye looks a bit too deep set, you can just increase the amount of highlight colour surrounding it to bring it out a bit. Once I get to this point in the proceedings where I'm just nitpicking, looking for areas to touch up, it's probably time to stop. Otherwise I'm going to overwork the painting. One final thing I will do though is to repair the bottom edge of the branch where I accidentally painted over it when doing the tail. And there is my rainbow lorikeet on a blurry background. If you decide to give this painting a try and then you have questions or need help anywhere along the way, please don't hesitate to drop me a line. Also, please subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. If you want to keep informed about all the other art learning resources I create, then please join my email list by clicking the sign up button on my channel's homepage. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.